Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Thanks for tuning in. Once again, appreciate you guys making the time always to be here and, learn with me. Go through these books, learn a more realistic history. Again, we do this for education purposes under fair use, for review, critique, education, commentary under fair use. All right, we're going to get into today the book Blacks of the Land. Yeah. And when they mean blacks of the land, they talking about American Indians. Remember, we just recently went over this and we've gone over it so many times that mainland American Indians were being called the blacks of the land, and so-called people from the other side of the world were being called blacks of Guinea, right? So the blacks of the land were the American Indians. It says Indian slavery, settler society, and the Portuguese colonial enterprise in South America. Again, this is a translated version of John M. Monteiro's writing of Negros de Terra, edited and translated by James Woodward and Barbara Weinstein. They took his, what he wrote and they just translated it, okay, into English. This is the original book right here. Again, Negros de Terra, Indians and Banderistas, and the origins of the Sao Paulo. John Manuel Monteiro. This is what they're translating. This is what we're going to read today, all right? Again, under fair use. Very few pages, not the whole book, obviously. Fair use. Thank you for being here. Let's go ahead and read a little bit about this book. So it says here, again, Blacks of the Land, originally published in Portuguese in 1994 as Negros de Terra. This field-defining work by the late historian John M. Monteiro has been translated into English by Professor James Woodward and Barbara Weinstein. Monteiro's work established ethnohistory as a field in colonial Brazilian studies and made indigenous history a vital part of how scholars understand Brazil's colonial past. Drawing over 24 collections on both sides of the Atlantic, Monteiro rescued Indians from invisibility, documenting their roles as both objects and actors in Brazil's colonial past, and most importantly, providing the first history of Indian slavery in Brazil. Okay, Indian slavery. Monteiro demonstrates how Indian enslavement, not exploration or the search for mineral wealth, was the driving force behind the expansion out of Sao Paulo and through the South American backcountry. All right, that was the driving force, Indian slavery. This book makes a groundbreaking contribution not only to Latin American history, but to the history of indigenous slavery in the Americas generally, okay? This is what I'm trying to tell you in this series, the real slave trade. As you guys can see, this is what they hid from us. They downplayed. They want us to think it was very small and that eventually they were replaced by so-called Africans. And we got to, again, always start to hijack and review the primary sources to see what is the true history, okay? So just a little bit here of the foreword. It says here by James Woodward, the guy who translated, says, beginning in the 1490s in the Caribbean and through the slow demise of native slavery in North and South America over the 18th and 19th centuries, 1800s, right? Millions, listen, pay attention, wake up. Millions of Amerindians were subjected to enslavement, captivity, and forced labor. Again, millions. Indian slavery was practiced across the Americas at one point in time or another, in jurisdictions claimed by every European power that engaged in New World colonialism. Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, English, Scottish, French, and Russian colonists held Native Americans as slaves, exerting their mastery over them and dealing in them as chattel, all right? As chattel, not Africans. All right, millions in chattel. All right, so we're going to go get a little bit of the chapter 1 here. It says here, the transformation of indigenous Sao Paulo in the 16th century, all right? That's the 1500s. So we're going to belly flop to This part of chapter 1 of the book, it says here, colonists on the offensive. As it became increasingly clear that the Mission Village project was insufficient as a means of providing labor force, the colonists intensified other means of acquiring Indians for their service. Beginning in the 1580s, despite the restrictions imposed by Portuguese legislation, the settlers began to favor the direct appropriation of indigenous laborers through predatory expeditions into the wilderness. Actually, strict observance of the letter of the law was never among the favorite practices of the Paulistas. While the law of 1570 and the subsequent legislation made allowance for slavery through the institution of just war, the captives that the Paulistas sought did not always match the provisions of the law. Most of the groups that qualified as indomitable and subject to just war were so-called tapuya, with the law of 1570 explicitly singling out the Ayamori, and a denomination that included various Gi or G peoples who arduously persisted Portuguese expansion on the Bahian coast. From early on, though, the settlers showed a clear preference for Tupi and Guarani captives. For various reasons, greater demographic density, easier communication using the Tupian lingua geral spoken on much of the coast, and the greater likelihood of forming alliances. With the latter context established, the prospect of new captives vindicated their interests. The issue of labor also stood out in the somewhat stereotyped distinction between Tupi and Tapuya, referring to the Guiana of Sao Paulo. Gabriel Suarez de Sousa remarked, and whoever happens to have a Guiana slave expects no service from him. All right, Guiana, Guinea, Guiana slave, talking about South America, not Guinea, Guiana. Look at how those words could get interchanged a little bit in history. Because they are a people of lazy by nature and do not know how to work. Until the mid-18th century, colonists departing for the wilderness in search of captives employed this dichotomous distinction. Innumerable denunciations emerged throughout this long period, indicating that the settlers set out with the aim of subduing the most treacherous, barbarous, and indomitable peoples and bringing them into the bosom of the church, but returned more often than not with Tupi captives. Most of them women and children. Listen, that was their pretext, but they were just literally just enslaving the Tupi. Commenting on the activities of a troop of Paulistas who were recruited to combat the dreaded Tapuyas of Corso. In the late 17th century, the Governor General explained to the Crown the Paulistas leave their land and sent out various bands throughout the wilderness with no other intent but to capture heathen of the lingua geral, who are the ones who are already domesticated, and they do not bother with the Corso heathen, because these are no good for anything. A similar strategy, taking Tupi and Guarani captives in the midst of just wars had already manifested itself in the 16th century and the captaincy of São Vicente. The declaration of a just war against the Carijo in 1585 served as a precursor to what soon became a general practice, all right? They were enslaving the Carijo, the Tupi, and all these other different nations, guys. These are your so-called blacks of the land. Pay attention. At that time, the settlers of São Vicente, Santos, and Sao Paulo drafted a petition to the governor of the captaincy requesting authorization to organize a war party against the Carijo in the interior of the captaincy. The document made a point of detailing the real motive behind the enterprise before recounting the hostilities perpetrated by the Carijo. The petition detailed the desperate need for slaves. I thought they had all these Africans. Why would they desperately need slaves in the captaincy, particularly on the sugar-producing coast? Pointing out that 2,000 slaves had perished from disease in the previous 6 years. The settlers cautioned that without slaves they could not maintain commodity production, thus depriving the crown of valuable tithes. Having established this basic need, the settlers sent a request to the governor that your mercy with the people of this captaincy make open war upon the Indians called the Carijos, who have deserved such for many years for having killed in the last 40 years more than 150 Europeans, both Portuguese and Spanish. They even killed fathers of the Company of Jesus, all right, Jesuits, who went to indoctrinate them and teach them our holy Catholic faith. Yeah, right. I bet you they were doing evil things too. So you see who they going after? They're going after the people who refuse to bow down, who give up their lands, their right, their identity to be enslaved, right? Those are who they're really going after. They try to make all these excuses for just of war because they're savages, right? But you see, the truth is something else because we only get in one version. So based on isolated incidents involving specific factions, this description of the Carijo as a barbarous and violent people contrasted sharply with the comments of settlers and missionaries alike, who considered the Guarani to be superior to other indigenous peoples. Furthermore, it did not justify indiscriminate war against all Carijo, as this generic denomination included groups that were allied with the Portuguese. In short, the settlers clearly sought to create a situation where they could legally and unrestrictedly fill their labor needs with the coveted Guarani. They were just trying to make up different ways to just enslave whoever they wanted. A few weeks after the petition was submitted, Governor Jerónimo Leitao or Leitao summoned representatives of the municipal councils of 3 towns to a meeting at the Engenjo, Sao Jorge, and Sao Vicente with the aim of delineating the conditions of a just war, seeking to avoid any interference on the part of the Jesuits. The governor had called upon the Vicar of Sao Vicente to represent the clergy, thus conferring greater legitimacy upon the resolution that the meeting produced. This resolution established that captives taken in battle would be divided between the 3 towns, with the municipal councils charged with distributing them among the settlers for them to indoctrinate them and give them good treatment as free heathen, and for them to help them in their service in what is licit. The treatment of the Indians as free heathen, in parentheses, right, illustrates the contradictory nature of the whole process. For had the war really been just, following the strictures of the law of 1570, the settlers could have held the captives as legitimate slaves. So how are they free? And in fact, the strategy of legitimating the recruitment of Indian slaves, all right, not Africans, through just war hardly disguised the settlers' aim of rapidly increasing their holdings of Guarani and non-Guarani captives. The 1585 expedition, in this sense, reflected a general trend on the upswing through the 1580s as the settlers intensified their raids into the Sertão, including private raids and expeditions sanctioned by representatives of the crown. Jerónimo Leitao, for example, had already led an attack against the Tememino in 1581, while other settlers organized forays of their own along the Tiete and Paraiba River valleys. All right. So again, a quick reminder, when they're saying all these Portuguese and Spanish, who are doing the enslaving and, owning the sugar plantation, a lot of these are so-called black folks, right? Black Europeans, a lot of them crypto Jews, crypto Muslim, Marranos, Moriscos, or just, some black Europeans, right? So let's not forget that, okay? These actions provoked a new wave of unrest at the edges of Portuguese settlement, as Guiana, Guarulhos, and Tupiniquim, the Guayana. Wow, I didn't know that was the Indian group. So the Guiana, that comes from Indian, okay? That name Guiana, talking about Guineas. Come on, Guiana, the Guayana, the Guyana, the Guayana, the Guarulhos and Tupiniquim groups received Europeans and their indigenous agents with increasing violence. They weren't having it. In 1583, the Municipal Council of Sao Paulo warned settlers to avoid Guayana villages because of the dangers involved. 4 years later, the council discussed the imminent danger of there being here many Guayana heathen, and thus the greater part of the heathen of the Sertao who speak badly, example, in non-Tupi languages, and are up in arms. More than ever before, indigenous resistance was explicitly tied to the question of slavery. All right? Indigenous resistance, slavery. In 1590, according to the municipal council, all of the villages of the Sertao of this captaincy joined together to repel the European presence in the region. At that time, an allied force of Guayana and Tupiniquim destroyed an expedition of 50 men led by Domingo Luis Grou and Antonio Macedo near where the town of Mogi, listen to that, look at that, Mogi or Magi, das Cruces, Mogi das Cruces will later be founded. Following this victory, these allied indigenous groups launched new attacks on Portuguese farms along the Pinheiros River, and with the support of the residents of the Pinheiros Mission Village, staged a surprisingly broad-based rebellion against European control of the region. 1 year later, to the west of the town of Sao Paulo, at the locality called Parnaíba, Indians destroyed another slaving expedition on the Tietê River. All right, so you guys see, like, this is literally almost the same areas as what we read the other day, right, of the cacique from Venezuela, right, unsung heroes. Same people, same going on. There's a lot of resistance going on in South America at these times, guys, and these are the people they are enslaving, these rebels, all right? Continues, says the increasing hostility of the Indians was used to justify the organization of punitive forces that in a wave of reprisals between 1590 and 1595 ended up destroying or enslaving the native population, destroying or enslaving, two big different things, enslaving, what? Enslaving the whole native population, enslaving, then they get reclassified, right? Blacks of the land, huh? So-called Negroes. Oh, they brought up Negroes, right? 1619. They say they brought up some very odd Negroes in 1619 to Virginia. And we got all these Indians being enslaved way before that. You see, this is way before Jamestown, guys. Way before 1619, as you guys can see. And that ship that was carrying these people from 1619 that ended up in Virginia was raided from a ship that was docked in Veracruz, Mexico. That ship was coming from Lisbon, Portugal. It never went to West Africa. It was on the coast of South America, where we're reading about right now. And then it came up to the coast of Central America, up to Mexico, where it got raided. And these people were taken from that ship. So, you know, who's to say it couldn't have been some of these Indians right here that were being enslaved all over South America, right? The principal victims, all right, despite the energetic protests of the Jesuits, were the Tupiniquim, who were singled out because they were our neighbors and were friends with us and were our compadres. And they interacted with us, enjoying our barter, goods, and friendliness, and this for many years. At the same time, the Guayana and Guarulhos retreated to the Paraiba Valley or beyond the Cantareira Range to become involved with the Paulistas again only in the 1640s. All right. And we move on a little bit, we belly flop a little bit to chapter 2. It says here, backcountry incursions and the expansion of the labor force. Throughout the 17th century, colonists from Sao Paulo and the neighboring towns attacked hundreds of indigenous villages in various regions, bringing thousands of Amerindians from different societies to their estates and farms in a state of compulsory service, right? Into slavery. Thousands. These expeditions into the interior provided a growing mass of indigenous manual labor on the Paulista Plateau, which in turn enabled the production and transport of an agricultural surplus, linking, albeit modestly, the region to other parts of the Portuguese colony and even to the commercial circuits of the South Atlantic. All right, this is who they using, American Indians for this, not Africans. And we belly flop a little more ahead. It says here the riches of the wilderness, slaving expeditions to the interior, and the Indian slave trade in Sao Paulo date back to the remote origins of the colony, right from the beginning. But in the 17th century, they began to assume new qualitative and quantitative dimensions, right? In the 1600s, the experience of the 16th century had introduced diverse methods of acquiring Indian labor, ranging from resgate or barter to saltos, raids, to the larger scale punitive expeditions of the 1580s and 1590s. These models were perfected and expanded by the settlers to meet the demands of the new century, while the small scale barter and raiding activities of the 16th century had been restricted to the Tietê River Valley and nearby areas. Expeditions now projected themselves over greater distances and became integrated with an emerging intra-colonial trade network. And while the punitive campaigns of the 1590s manifested defensive and territorial goals, the larger scale expeditions became more explicitly tied to a program of colonial development. The development project of Don Francisco de Souza, right? De Souza, the black royal monarchs of Portugal, right? The Sousas, right? Remember? Have provided powerful incentives for the intensification of Portuguese incursions into the backlands. As Governor General of Brazil between 1591 and 1601, Dom Francisco doggedly focused on the search for mineral wealth, a fixation stimulated by the Tupiniquim legend of Itaberaba Aku, or Asu, a shining mountain range supposedly located at the headwaters of the São Francisco River. In the Portuguese imaginary, the legendary range was transmuted into a single peak of silver studded with emeralds, and its name was corrupted to Sabarabuku. In 1596, Don Francisco outfitted 3 expeditions which departed simultaneously from Bahia Espírito Santo in Sao Paulo in search of the source of the São Francisco. The Paulista expedition, led by João Pereira de Souza Botafogo, had in its ranks at least 25 settlers, each with his own retinue of Indians. The explorers marched along the Paraiba Valley, crossed the Mantiqueira Range, and believed that they had reached their destination at a point some 70 or 80 leagues from Sao Paulo. One part of the group contained on the Salvador barren samples of precious stones, and another went on to explore the region of the Paraupava, Araguaia, Tocantins, but the majority returned to Sao Paulo satisfied with the Tupinamba they had captured in the Paraiba Valley. You see that? So they didn't really find their mountains, their emeralds, their silver, but they got to enslave some Indians along the way, and well, that made the whole trip, worth it. So it says, encouraged by the results of the Souza Botafogo expedition, Don Francisco turned his attention to the south, where he assembled an entourage of practical miners from Germany, Holland, and Spain. Subsequent expeditions to the São Francisco River region yielded little in terms of mineral wealth, but during Don Francisco's time in Sao Paulo, gold and iron deposits were discovered not far from the town. After his mandate as governor of Brazil came to an end, Don Francisco traveled to Portugal, where he lobbied the king to obtain the requisites that would allow him to follow through on an ambitious plan for the development of the southern captaincies of Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Espírito Santo. By 1608, he was once again in Sao Paulo, armed with the titles of Governor of the South and Marquis of the Mines. Don Francisco's plan was to create an economy made up of interlinked mining, agricultural, and industrial sectors, each of which would rely upon a solid base of Indian workers. His proposal was perhaps inspired by the model then in place in Spanish America, where the Indian masses, laboring in an integrated network of agricultural and mining enterprises, generated large fortunes for Spanish settlers while filling the royal coffers. However, in Brazil, the plan soon failed. Unlike the Spanish and Andean South America, who found a seemingly inexhaustible source of silver ore at Potosi in present-day Bolivia, the Portuguese under Don Francisco made only the modest discoveries of the Jaragua, Parnaíba, and Boturuna mines, which yielded disappointingly small amounts of gold. At the same time, in spite of the establishment of an iron works in Santo Amaro around 1609, and the supposed founding of a town near where the city of Sorocaba would be founded years later, and where significant deposits of iron ore did in fact exist, the plan's industrial aspects failed as well. Even so, the attempt by Don Francisco and his associates to transform the back country of southern Brazil into a lively and dynamic hub of European enterprise affected the organization of the local economy of Sao Paulo. On the one hand, as we shall see, the growth of commercial agriculture was stimulated, and on the other, the enslavement of Indian laborers reached unprecedented proportions. Unprecedented, but I thought they had Africans. Between 1599, when he arrived in Sao Paulo for the first time in 1611, and in 1611 when he died, Don Francisco authorized several expeditions in search of mines and Indians, some of which he also outfitted. Only one of these journeys, led by Andre de Leao in 1601 and backed by Don Francisco's inner circle, returned to the Sabarabuku region, spending 9 months in a futile search for silver that produced little beyond the fascinating account of the Dutch practical miner William Jos ten Glimmers. In view of the high cost and negligible success of this excursion, Don Francisco and his coterie began to concentrate on the potential of the Sao Paulo region. Expeditions into the interior now sought the indiscriminate capture of Indians, of the sertões that surrounded Sao Paulo. Indeed, early 17th century expeditions produced identical returns, large numbers of captives, and no mineral wealth, all right? This is literally what they were starting to do. They weren't getting no minerals, they were literally enslaving. And that whole story that they were looking for minerals, that's probably just a backstory. They were always planning to enslave and get slaves. That was their real expedition, a slavery expedition, enslavement expedition, right? Large numbers of captives and no mineral wealth. In 1602 to 1603, an expedition led by Nicolau Barreiro, with about 100 settlers in its ranks, captured around 2,000 Tememino Indians, right? They captured them, 2,000 of them as slaves, right? While scoring the Paranapanema River Valley. 4 years later, an expedition under the command of the Mamaluco Belchior Diaz Carneiro returned to Sao Paulo with hundreds of captives from the Sertão dos Bilreiros, all right? Indian slaves, guys, not Africans. This is who they're enslaving. All right, several hundreds captives, despite the attacks of the southern Cayapo, who slaughtered several colonists. The band captained by Martín Rodriguez Tenorio de Aguilar met a similar fate at the hands of the Cayapo a couple of years later. But the slavers found greater success to the south and west, where there were dense populations of Tememino and Guarani. Two expeditions of 1610 connected with the exploration of iron mines near Sorocaba took many captives belonging to those two groups. Finally, in 1611, on the last journey sponsored by Don Francisco, Pedro Vaz de Barros succeeded in enslaving 500 Guarani from the region of Guayara, okay? Listen, who they're enslaving, guys. Pay attention to the numbers. Just pay attention to the numbers. This is who they're enslaving, right? So settlers who took part in these expeditions may have harbored vague hopes of striking it rich with the discovery of silver, but the vast majority enlisted in these ventures because they offered the opportunity to create or expand slave holdings. This is why they were really doing it. Listen, why would they be doing this if they had all these Africans, right? The search for mineral wealth thus provided a view of legitimacy for the explorers' real intentions. The importance of this artifice should not be underestimated, as once the Crown began to enact legal restrictions on Indian slavery, settlers sought any pretext that might safeguard their slaving activities. Alfonso Sardiña, for example, settling out for the Sertao in 1598 with other young men and more than 100 Christian Indians, alleged that his only intention was to search for gold and other metals. That's what he kept telling. That's what they were telling the authorities so they could get these permits, right? The Municipal Council of Sao Paulo, always ready to defend the expedition, requesting the governor's authorization for incursions to the Sertao to recapture runaway Indians, right? Yeah, runaway Indians, huh? Ah, not Africans, huh? Runaway Indians. Whatever the pretext employed by the settlers to justify their incursions, their principal goal was clearly the acquisition of Carijo or Guarani, who inhabited a vast territory to the south and southwest of Sao Paulo. During the early decades of the 17th century, the Paulistas concentrated their activities in two regions, which came to be known as the Sertao dos Patos and the Sertao dos Carijos. The Sertao dos Patos, located in the interior of what is now the state of Santa Catarina, was inhabited almost exclusively by Guarani speakers, identified using such terms as Carijo, Araja or Aracha, and Patos, among others. The Sertao dos Carijos included vast stretches of territory beyond the banks of the Panema River to the southwest of Sao Paulo, inhabited primarily by Guarani, though also by various non-Guarani groups, while the exact geographic location and dimensions of the Sertao dos Carijos are not clear. The term most likely referred to Guaira, an area circumscribed by the Piquiri, Parana, Panema, and Tibagi rivers. Because of its relatively easy access, at a 40 to 60 day march from Sao Paulo, Guaira soon became the principal destination of the expeditions that set out from Sao Paulo. But this trek inevitably brought the Paulistas into contact with other indigenous groups occupying the lands between Sao Paulo and Guaira, particularly the Paranapanema Valley. Two groups, the Tememino and the Tupinay, appear in the documentation of the era as the major victims of the expeditions. Major victims, right? Not Africans. These indigenous people, the Tememino and the Tupinay, the major victims of these enslavement expeditions that set out during the first decade of the 17th century. Little is known about relations between the Portuguese and these groups besides the fact that large numbers of Tememino were introduced into Sao Paulo at 2 points. Following the expedition of Nicolau Barreto of 1602 to 1604, and in 1607 when Manuel Barreto peacefully persuaded a large group which he encountered on his return from Spanish Guaira to move their village to his estate northwest of the town of Sao Paulo. Whereas wills and inventories from early 17th century identified a wide variety of indigenous groups beginning in the 1610s, this diversity gave way to the predominance of Guarani captives and Paulista slaveholdings. This suggests that during the first decade of the new century, the Paulistas occupied themselves mainly with preparing the way for the large-scale assaults on the Guarani that characterized the period of 1610 to 1640. Wow, for 30 years, guys. You see that? Large-scale assaults on the Guarani, enslaving them for 30 years straight. And even before that, right, we just read. At that point, the most important aspect of the expeditions against the Tememino lay precisely in the building up the ranks of the Paulistas, Indian warriors, who would later play a key role in the Paulistas' raids against the Guarani of Guaira. It is possible that these Tememinos were the Tupi that appear in 16th century chronicles as traditional enemies of the Guarani, inhabiting the region between Sao Paulo and Paraguay. If so, they were also the Tupi frequently cited by Spanish Jesuits as the faithful auxiliaries of the Paulistas in their assaults on the missions. So the help of Indians, right? Always. Manuel Preto, again, Manuel Preto, which means so-called black, one of the principal leaders in the destruction of the Guaira missions, supposedly led a force of 999 archers. Wow. Probably an inflated reference to warriors belonging to the Tememino group he had acquired in 1607. The mobilization of native warriors for the purpose of enslaving their traditional enemies, who would then serve the colonists, was nothing new in Portuguese indigenous relations, but it took on entirely new proportions and characteristics in 17th century Sao Paulo before they launched their large scale military organized assaults on the Guarani. The Portuguese acquired slaves primarily by dealing with Indian intermediaries. As in the 16th century, trade and alliance continued to play important roles in the strategies of settlers seeking to bring captives into the European sphere. Still novices in their knowledge of the Sertão at that point, and with their paramilitary forces still in formation, the Paulistas depended upon these intermediaries, especially as they ventured further from Sao Paulo in 1612, explaining why the Paulistas were so successful in the capture of Indians in Guaira. The governor of Buenos Aires informed the Spanish crown that their success was due to the collaboration of certain Guarani chiefs who served them as guides on these forays, all right, because they had help from other Indians. All expeditions to the Sertão were outfitted with copious supplies of trinkets and tools for bartering with Indians encountered along the way. Indeed, the Jesuits were not above trafficking in such articles, in providing an account of expenses incurred on a mission to the Patos region. The Jesuit Pedro Rodriguez noted that he spent 12 milres on barter goods of knives, fishhooks, glass beads, mirrors, and other things of this sort, which I twice took to distribute in the villages of the southern captaincies, giving prizes to the male and female Indians who best knew Christian doctrine. You see what they're doing? Giving them trinkets as prizes for being good Christian students. Among the scarce possessions of Francisco Ribeiro, listed in an inventory hastily scribbled in the wilderness, were 6 scissors for barter and 9 combs for barter. A few years later, Manuel Pinto noted in his will that he once outfitted Fernão Gomes with a red cap and some beads for barter in the Patos. Each of these items was assessed at an exceedingly low value in Portuguese terms. It is impossible to assess, however, the return such items brought the Portuguese, or, from the opposite point of view, the destructive impact these objects had on the traditional practices of indigenous societies. For their part, the Portuguese harbored no illusions about the nature of barter. It was to serve short-term purposes and was often carried out with the cynical assumption that today's friends might become tomorrow's slaves. All right? This is why they were doing it. This position was especially clear when sugarcane brandy was added to the array of barter goods. Describing trade with the villages of the south, a mill-owning planter from Rio de Janeiro is supposed to have said, "These people are very fond of sugarcane brandy. Consequently, we make them a present of it in order to please them all the more." All right, so now they're giving them the fire water, right? The fire water so they can be drunk, getting them to become alcoholics, right? The case of the southern Cayapo, or Bilreiros, of Gi-speaking group that occupied an extensive stretch of territory to the northwest of the town of Sao Paulo offers a good example of the fate of an intermediary group early on. Paulistas did view the Cayapo as potential captives. In fact, experience showed throughout the 17th and 18th centuries that the enslavement of Cayapo was very difficult. A Jesuit observer described the Cayapo as fearsome warriors, known for striking down their foes with unerring blows to the head. In their battles, he continued, they took many prisoners with the intention of eating them. Though this last allegation is false, all right, that's the hijack. You see that? All right, they try to put that in there. That is false. since the Kayapo did not practice cannibalism, okay? The acquisition of captives may have been the key to the early amicable relations between the Portuguese and this indigenous group. Several expeditions that set out for the Certao dos Virreyos in the early years of the 17th century brought back non-Kayapo captives, suggesting that these prisoners were acquired through trade with the Kayapo. Friendly relations, however, were short-lived. Two major expeditions were destroyed by the Kayapo between 1608 and 1612. From that point on, the Kayapo became the objects of Portuguese hostility, threatened with enslavement or extermination. All right, reclassification, paper genocide. It was only by seeking refuge in remote certos that the Kayapo were able to avoid new conflicts for more than a century thereafter. Wow, century, 100 years. The principal intermediaries of the incipient trade in Indian slaves were to be found in the Patos region, with the so-called port of Patos served as the main center in the organized traffic in Guarani captives. That's a slave port. They don't want to call it. That's a real slave port right there, where they're getting a lot of your so-called Negroes that they're sending to other plantations in the Americas or other parts of the world, guys. A real slave port right here, the so-called port of Patos, the main center of the organized traffic in Guarani captives, Indian captives, right? Not Africans. According to the Jesuits who visited the region in the late 16th century, a few villages on the coast specialized in Portuguese Guarani trade, while the main settlements of the region lay in the interior, 20 to 30 leagues away. A few years later, trade having developed considerably, another priest outlined the methods of trade. There are some villages of heathens friendly to the Portuguese, to whom the latter carry barter goods of tools and clothing, and in exchange they gave up their own friends and relatives. You guys hear that? Wow. At the port of Patos, these captives were shackled and shipped. Where they were what? Shackled and shipped, put on ships, Deuteronomy 28, to the captaincies of São Vicente or Rio de Janeiro. While the allegation that the Indians of the coast turned their own relatives and friends over to the Portuguese seems to be an exaggeration, there is no doubt at all that the Portuguese manipulated intercommunal and family relations in order to achieve their aims. By the same token, some Indian leaders strayed from custom and took advantage of their position as intermediaries, accumulating power and even wealth. All right, these are the sellouts right here, right? Such was the case of a certain tubarão, or shark, right? The tiburón, the shark, who along with his 3 or 4 brothers, all supposedly shamans, became the main supplier of Guarani captives in the Patos region during the first decade of the 17th century. Wow. Tubarão, the shark, and his 4 brothers, right? You guys hear that? Enslaving their own peoples, selling out so they can become powerful and rich, so they wouldn't be enslaved. Selling out their own peoples, right? The main suppliers of the Guarani captives, right? Wow, they weren't doing that in Africa. They're doing that in their own land in South America. Once again, it falls to the Jesuits to describe in rich detail the system of supplying Indian slaves, arriving in the Patos Lagoon in ships laden with tools, cloth, and other barter goods. Portuguese merchants would summon Tubarão and his brothers. Who? Portuguese merchants, crypto Jews. Portuguese, who's the merchants? Oh, don't forget. And then they going what? Doing business with other melanated folks. Tubarão and his brothers, the slave, the Indian sellouts. These intermediaries, for their part, would furnish Araha captives taken by the Carijo and internecine conflicts in exchange for the European goods. In addition to these war captives, Tubarão and his brothers would also bring unattached people, orphans and widows, listen, for example, from the Carijo villages of the interior and trade them as well. Finally, other Indians would come on their own account to barter with the Portuguese, offering local products such as the sturdy hammocks that were widely used in European settlements. According to the Jesuit account, these ingenious peddlers would also be enslaved by the insatiable Portuguese. You guys hear that? Damn. So they would just try and make a little money and say, hey, I'll trade this when they would get enslaved. They would get kidnapped, just like they told us Africans were getting kidnapped. You see, we don't even remember or pity any of these people who were obviously, because the book is called Blacks of the Land. We already told you they were calling all these people blacks, Negroes, Negroes de Terra, Negroes. These same people are a lot of your supposed African slaves. Wake up. This maritime slave trade, probably quite small in scale before 1630s, was also facilitated by royal officials acting in collusion with the settlers of São Vicente, Santos, and Rio de Janeiro. The Jesuits of southern Brazil themselves, interested in moving the Carijo of the Patos region to mission villages near Portuguese settlements, complained repeatedly that civil authorities were deeply involved in the unjust enslavement of the Guarani. Unjust enslavement of the Guarani. According to one priest, the crown officials who were supposed to assist the Jesuits in establishment of mission villages acted duplicitously, collaborating with the priests in transporting Guarani to the coast. You hear what the Jesuits were doing? But then turning the Indians over to settlers to serve them as slaves. Wow. So why would they be doing if they had all these Africans, right? Referring to an expedition that took place around 1619, around the same time to Virginia, right? They landed in Virginia, these so-called Negroes, right? Listen, an expedition was going on. In 1619, the same priest explained that the original objective was to bring together a large number of Araja or Aracha and Carijo Indians already brought from the interior by both Jesuits and backwoodsmen, and to transfer them to mission villages in São Vicente, Rio de Janeiro, and Cabo Frio in a ship outfitted by Antonio Mendes de Vasconcelos as Rio de Janeiro, a Rio de Janeiro merchant, Vasconcelos, who's the merchant. So listen, guys. So these expeditions going on in 1619, how do you know maybe some of these didn't get caught up in the São João Bautista ship that was coming from Portugal? It's the same people. How do you know they wouldn't sell some on the way? Oh, if they could, if they got the money from somebody, say, hey, I'll offer you this much for 100 of them, right? And then they take them up to Veracruz, and then they get raided by the so-called English on other cryptos and pirates, and then they get brought to Virginia, and now they're called 20-odd Negroes. Remember, Indians from South America are being called Negroes. So we can't conjecture and say these were Africans. That's a conjecture. We got to go with what's logical. We see what's logical. History's telling us these people were enslaving American Indians and bringing in their undesirables from Europe. That's who they were using as slaves. All right, so yeah, maybe these people got caught up. You never know. However, when the expedition arrived in São Vicente, the Jesuits' participation ended abruptly as the Indians were turned over to private traders and sent on the slave markets of Bahia, Pernambuco, and even Portugal. Oh my God, I can't believe I just read this, guys. I really can't believe I just read this, guys. I think I just solved where these so-called 20-odd Negroes were coming from. Literally. So they were supposed to go to these areas right here, right? They were supposed to go to these areas, but they ended up what? Because the Jesuits didn't want to participate anymore. These Indians in 1619, pay attention, guys. This is a big one right here. I'm gonna make a future video. This is a big one. I'm gonna research this. They were turned over to private traders. Oh, they don't want to give us the name. Were these private traders the ones who were navigating the ship, the São João Bautista? Could it have been the São João Bautista? The same one that was carrying these 20-odd Negroes that ended up in Virginia in the same year, 1619? Come on now, guys, look at the coincidence. I don't think this is a coincidence. This is big right here. I'm gonna highlight this. This is big. This is big. This is big. All right. I was just saying that to, just to, think. I didn't think they were really going to say that they actually ended up somewhere else. They actually ended up somewhere else. Wow. This might be a major one right here, guys. I'm gonna follow up on that. All right. What is the coincidence, huh? As the demand for slaves increased, violence became an increasingly important tool in the acquisition of captives. As in the case of the Kayapo alliances and trade relations, even when strengthened by kinship ties between colonists and Indians, degenerated to the point where former allies were reduced to captivity. In the Patos region, barter between the Portuguese and the Guarani gave way to unprovoked attacks on the latter by the Europeans and their Indian henchmen. Their Indian henchmen, the sellouts. Pedro Rodriguez, a Jesuit missionary familiar with the region, related a specific case in which Portuguese traders arrived at the port of Patos with the apparent intention of bartering with local headmen whom they had already engaged in friendship and exchanges, enticing the Indians to the port in order to trade. The Portuguese, in bad faith, took an Indian headman with others who accompanied him, which would be about 40 all told, and put them all in irons and took them by force to the ship, and soon they arrived at the captaincy of Sao Vicente. So even these people who they were helping, right? I mean, these Indians that were helping the Portuguese, they themselves got enslaved one day. They were the ones bringing them the slaves, and all of a sudden they got enslaved by the same people they were uh, giving the other Indians to, right? To them, right? That's crazy. You see what they got? Now they got enslaved too. Such acts of violence were not always preceded by the artifice of exchange. A rare criminal investigation which inquired into the death of the Guarani chief Timacauna offers an exemplary account of straightforward enslavement. All right, straightforward enslavement. In this case, Timacauna was in the process of moving his village to a site not far from Sao Paulo when he was suddenly attacked by Pombeiros Negros. Pombeiros Negros. Belonging to some Paulistas. Having murdered Timacauna, these hostile Indians enslaved the remaining Guarani. All right. So who was these Pombeiro Negros? They were under other Indians. This is big, guys. Listen, this is what I'm trying to tell you. Wow. This is what I'm trying to tell you. So these Paulistas attacked the Timacauna chief and his people on the way to them moving to another village with some Pombeiro Negros. All right, these hostile Indians enslaved the remaining Guarani. They were hostile Indians, these Pombeiro Negros, okay, who were brought to Sao Paulo and divided up among their masters. They're calling Indians Negros, guys. The Portuguese were calling these hostile Indians Pombeiro Negros. Come on, guys. The use of the term Pombeiro in this context is noteworthy. It being a word of African origin, that's the hijack, referring to Africans or half-castes who were charged with providing slaves from the interior of that continent for the Portuguese merchants of that coast. Now listen to this, guys. But these specific black Pombeiros, listen, the black Pombeiros in this case were colonial Indian slaves who specialized in the enslavement of Indians from the said Tao. We're not talking about Africans, all right? Body bag for the illusion, all right? Shout out to Drop. You guys see that? Even though they try to say this word always related to Africans, listen, they're telling you right here, and they got a source for that. It says the black Pombeiros, these Negro Pombeiros in this case, were colonial Indian slaves. They weren't Africans, they were Indians. They were Indians, not Africans. They were Indians, these Negroes, these Pombeiros Negros. I told you they were calling Indian Negroes here, guys. This is what I'm trying to explain to you guys. So that, you know, these people getting enslaved in 1619 and ended up in these international ports, that could have been the ones that were brought up in the Sao João Bautista ship that was coming from Lisbon, raided South America, picked them up, got raided themselves in, you know, Veracruz, Mexico by other English, so-called crypto Jews, so-called English, right? And then brought to Virginia, and they're called 20 odd Negroes. Meaning it's 20-something of them. If this practice was indeed widespread, right? So Indians are being called Negroes, right? And if this practice was indeed widespread, as it appears to have been, It would reflect a trend toward the internalization of the organizational aspects of slaving, as the Paulistas came to depend less on independent intermediaries and more on their own slaves. Their own slaves doing the work for them, other Indians. Indians, these black bombeiros, right? They call them black guys. Pay attention, wake up, wake up. These are not Africans. This represented a transformation in relations between whites and Indians, so-called whites, right? Europeans, contributing significantly to the redefinition of captives as slaves. So continuing a little further ahead, it says the Portuguese of Sao Paulo and the destruction of the Guaira. Most of the large expeditions had as their destination the numerous Guarani villages of Guaira. By the late 16th century, the native inhabitants of this region found themselves caught up in the conflicting interests of Spaniards, Portuguese, and Jesuits. Both the Spanish settlers of Paraguay and the Portuguese of Sao Paulo competed for access to Indian labor in the vast, vaguely defined borderlands that separated the frontier outposts of the two Iberian empires. However, neither group appeared interested in the permanent settlement of the territory, seeking rather to take Guarani captives. That's all they wanted, guys, just to capture slaves, while avoiding conflict with other indigenous groups living in the borderlands, who were well known for their aggressiveness. In other words, instead of behaving like Iberian rivals, the Paraguayans and the Paulistas shared common interests, reinforced by the prospect of mutually beneficial commercial relations, with the Paulistas supplying European articles and even African slaves in exchange, that's the hijack, for Indian slaves and silver. What African slaves? You mean other black Europeans or other Indians that you're now reclassifying in modern terms? Because they didn't say that. I bet you they said Negroes. I bet you they didn't say African. During the period of the Iberian Union, 1580 to 1640, despite royal prohibitions on trade between Portuguese and Spanish America, the members of the Municipal Council of Sao Paulo saw nothing wrong with opening a trail between Sao Paulo and Paraguay. It seemed good to all do the benefits expected of the opening of this trail, and us having friendship and trade as we are all Christian and a common king and of a common king. Right now they're all friends when they're gonna go after the Indians. If the Paraguayans and Paulistas had indeed succeeded in forging a harmonious relationship in the borderlands at the expense of the Guarani, of course their relations were unsettled by the Jesuit missionaries who arrived in the region beginning in 1609, when Father Giuseppe Cataldino and Simon Macera established the first reductions. From the start, the Jesuits cultivated poor relations with both sets of settlers, neither of which looked kindly upon the arrival of new contestants in the competition of Guarani labor. In Paraguay, the settlers counted on the support of the secular clergy and local crown officials in their campaign against the Jesuit presence, fearing that later would severely limit the labor supply by taking Guarani captives out of circulation. Listen, they were all worried about, hey, who's going to take the Guarani slaves, the Indian slaves? That prospect threatened the precarious economic base of Spanish colonial society in the region, which depended upon Guarani labor in agriculture, particularly in the cultivation, harvesting, and transport of the tea-like leaves of the mate plant. For the Paulistas who continued to take captives in Guaira without coming into direct conflict with the priests, the Jesuits' presence was less threatening, at least during the early years. After all, Guaira, extended through a vast territory and unreduced population, continued to outnumber that of the missions into the 1620s. Even on the eve of the Paulista invasion of 1628, the Jesuits only counted on 15 reductions in Guaira, some of which were inhabited by non-Guarani humans. The picture had begun to change by then, however, as the cumulative effects of the slaving expeditions, missionization, and epidemic disease limited the number of Guarani available to slavers, who turned their gaze to the relatively larger proportion of the total population that was concentrated in the missions. Indeed, the reductions may have been seen by the Paulistas rather as amplifications, since the population density of the missions was much greater than the free villages of the Guarani, Guayana, and Gualacho, Caingan, Kangan. Look at that, Kangan. Huh. Thus, the Paulistas attacked the missions not for moral or geopolitical reasons, as one strain of Paulistas historiography would have it, but simply because considerable numbers of Guaranis were to be found there. They were even slave raiding on their own missions. According to a Jesuit at the first, the Paulistas respected the priests, but with the growth of their greed, they began to attack the reductions. The problem, he continued, was that the Paulistas considered the region to be their exclusive preserve for the hunting of Indian captives. But the main reason for the attacks, the Jesuit concluded, was that the settlers simply wished to acquire cheap Indians. All right, again, you see what's going on in this region of the world during these times, guys, right? Remember earlier, millions eventually. Slaves, Indians. Historians have long claimed that the Paulistas attacked the reductions because these missions offered labor already transformed and disciplined by the Jesuits, thus better conditioned to work rhythms demanded by Brazil's sugar plantations. This notion underestimates, on the one hand, the pre-contact importance of Guarani horticulture, while overestimating the efficacy of the Jesuits' cultural project on the other. In fact, the Portuguese had been interested in the Guarani since the first half of the 16th century, precisely because the Guarani were known for having practiced agriculture going back to pre-colonial times. Furthermore, even after the arrival of the Spanish Jesuits in Guaira, the Paulistas continued to raid independent villages as well as the missions, all right? So look who they're targeting again. Why? Because they had practiced agriculture since pre-colonial times, way back. Finally, evidence from Jesuit documents written on the eve of the Paulista invasion clearly shows that the reductions of Guaira were not the prosperous, disciplined, utopian communities that later came to characterize the Jesuit enterprise of Paraguay. In fact, the periodic raids by Paulistas and Spaniards were only one among many problems impeding the development of the mission system. At the time of the largest Paulista raids on Guaira, which began in 1628, most of the missions were precarious and isolated communities that had been recently founded and were struggling to find a viable economic base that would ensure their survival. Remember, these missions, guys, are where they're holding the Indians. They're trying to take the Indian out of them, and they were literally just enslaving them. An account from 1625 referring to the material conditions of the Jesuit enterprise in the province of Paraguay reported that 5 reductions along the Parana were in an impoverished state, entirely dependent upon a meager 400 pesos stipend from Rome, since few subsistence plot had been planted. In Guaira, according to this report, the catechumens did not even produce enough to cover the barest expenses of the church. In 1628, with the Paulistas already camped on the banks of the Tibagi, Father Antonio Ruiz de Montoya, superior of the Guaira missions, wrote of other obstacles to success of the missions in his annual missive, outlining the situation of the province's 8 reductions. Ruiz added disease, hunger, factional rivalries, and inter-tribal warfare to the slave raids by the Paulistas and Spaniards as their population's principal woes. Of these, disease and inter-tribal warfare had certainly taken the greatest toll. Father Diego Salazar, charged with overseeing 2 of the largest missions, observed that most of the reductions are filled with contagion. In 1631, a violent epidemic raged between the Parana and the Paraguay rivers. which peopled the heavens with new Christians. This is where they got their supply, the Indian supply, to turn them into Christians or slaves, right? Inter-ethnic conflict was present in nearly all the missions and spelled real disaster on a few occasions, as in the case of Candelaria, which soon after its founding was destroyed by an army of infidels or Indians, right? They destroyed the mission, they weren't having it. The intensification of Paulistas' raids must thus be seen with this context of instability and uncertainty. The first of the large-scale enterprises led by Antonio Raposo Tavares set out from Sao Paulo in 1628, and though historians have taken this expedition to be a model for the organization of bandeirante slave raids, it was far from typical in its scale and structure. The size of Raposo Tavares' expeditionary force was disproportionately large when set against the scores of slave missions that took place in the 17th century. Most accounts claim that 900 Paulistas, including Portuguese and Mamelucos, and 2,000 Tupi warriors took part in the movement of slave raiding expeditions, guys, on American Indians. However, the number of Paulistas was probably far lower, as only 119 can be identified from other sources, and because the ratio of 2 Indians for each Paulista seemed exceedingly low when compared with other expeditions. At the same time, its disciplined military organization was atypical of the slaving expeditions that took place over the course of the century, which tended to be of a far more informal character. Testifying against the Paulistas in 1630, the Rio de Janeiro priest Pedro Homen Albernaz drew an interesting parallel between the Raposo Tavares expedition and the prevalent form of military organization in the colony. And thus, for these journeys, they raised captains and militia officers with banners and drums, pointing out that this violated the law. Indeed, the expedition had been organized in 4 companies, each with a standard and led by the principal leaders of the rural districts of Sao Paulo and Parnaíba. Raposo's Tavares company was further divided into advance and rear guards. While such tactical innovations were not incorporated into subsequent slaving expeditions, the Great Bandeira did represent a rupture with the past in the force and violence definitively replaced exchange and alliance as the predominant mode of labor recruitment in the Sertão. Though it is clear that the Raposo Tavares expedition left Sao Paulo with the explicit intent of capturing thousands of Guaranis, its leaders did not state that they planned to raid the missions of Guaira. As in earlier collective expeditions, such as the punitive raid of 1585 and Nicolau Barrero's expedition of 1602, Raposo Tavares and his captains carefully developed pretexts for their warlike operations. According to the Jesuit Maceta and Mansilla, authors of a detailed denunciation of the Paulistas' activities, one of the principal participants, Francisco Paiva, went so far as to obtain a right from the Holy Office of the Inquisition authorizing him to penetrate the Sertão in pursuit of a heretic. Don Luis Céspedes y Heria, the Spanish governor of Paraguay, who joined one of the companies for part of the trek, was told that the Paulistas sought to recapture the many Tupi, recaptured Tupi, Tememino, the Pelargo, and Carijo slaves who had fled and sought refuge in Guaira, runaway slaves, which were Indians. Backing up this justification, the company leaders, André Fernández and Pedro Vaz de Barros, carried legal authorization to recapture these fugitives. More substantive and palpable motives for the expedition emerged in a public meeting at the Municipal Council of Sao Paulo in late 1627, leading citizens, among whom Raposo Tavares was especially vociferous, complained that the Spaniards of Villarrica were encroaching on lands belonging to the Portuguese crown, taking all of the heathen of this crown's land for their repartimientos and personal services. So they're complaining that, hey, they're stealing all our slaves. They taking all our slaves, the Spanish. So they're fighting over the slaves, the Indian slaves, not Africans. It was a grave accusation to make amid the labor crisis facing the settlers in the 1620s. Less than 3 years earlier, the superintendent of mission villages surrounding Sao Paulo, Manuel João Branco, had complained of their depopulation, as the colonists were transferring the inhabitants of the villages to their own properties. Even the Governor General of Brazil recognized that, or the dearth of labor in Sao Paulo due to the many deaths, which probably were the result of epidemic disease. The Bandeira of 1628 began its activities cautiously with Raposo Tavares setting up camp on the banks of the Tibagi at the entrance to Guaira territory. From this base, the Paulistas began to raid independent Guarani villages and enslave their inhabitants, then turned their attention to the reductions. Their ends were achieved through naked violence. According to one Jesuit, the Paulistas' usual method was to surround a village and persuade its inhabitants by force or by trickery to accompany the settlers back to Sao Paulo. All right, Indian slaves, guys. Villages that resisted met a terrible fate. In such cases, the Portuguese enter, kill, burn, and destroy. And there have been cases in which they burned entire settlements merely to instill terror and awe in neighboring villages. The overland trip to Sao Paulo promised further horrors, such as killing the sick, the aged, cripples, and even children who delayed their relatives or the others from continuing the journey with this haste and expediency that they, the Paulistas, expect and demand sometimes with such excess that they will cut off the arms of some and use them to whip the others. Wow. You guys hear that? Another priest accused the Paulistas of acting with such cruelty that they do not seem to me to be Christians, killing the children and the old people who cannot keep up and giving them to their dogs to eat. All right? You guys hear what's going on, right? By 1632, successive raids had destroyed many independent Guarani villages and virtually all of the Guaira reductions. Thousands of Guarani slaves were marched to Sao Paulo. Again, thousands, guys. A small number of which were traded to other captaincies. Precisely how many, though, remains a difficult question, given the wide variation of estimates in contemporary accounts, some swollen by the ulterior political motives of Jesuit witnesses. Total figures as high as 300,000 are cited by historians. This unlikely sum may derive from a faulty transcription by a scribe in the court of Philip IV. Faulty, huh? Father Antonio Ruiz de Montoya stated that the Paulistas had destroyed 11 missions, each with population of 3,000 to 5,000 souls, which would mean that anywhere from 33 to 55,000 Indians were enslaved, assuming that all inhabitants were captured. Manuel Juan de Morales, a Spanish merchant resident in Sao Paulo, who's the merchants, noted the destruction of 14 reductions with an aggregate population of 40,000, of which 30,000 were enslaved. Just alone in one mission, guys, in one mission alone. You hear that? 14 reductions. Finally, Father Lorenzo de Mendoza of Rio de Janeiro, citing a certificate passed by Spanish Jesuits, reported that 14 reductions with 1,000 or 2,000 families each fell victim to the Paulistas, who brought 60,000 Guarani captives to Sao Paulo. Guys, these are then being brought to slave ports. These are people being brought to slave ports and being put to ships or put on other plantations in Brazil or other parts of the Americas. All right. We may add a fourth contemporary account by the governor of Buenos Aires, based on information from Ruiz de Montoya, which asserts that the Paulistas took 60,000 Indians from the province of Paraguay between 1628 and 1630. That's just 2 years. And they were doing this since the 1400s, right? And just in the small region right here, right? These figures are probably not very far from the truth, especially considering that the Paulistas preyed on independent communities as well as the reductions in their attacks on the Indians of Guaira. As for the missions, there were 15 in Guaira in 1628, 13 which were destroyed, while the remaining 2 were moved in 1631 to safer locations to the south along the Uruguay River. The vast majority of the missions, 12 of them, had been established less than 4 years before the Paulista invasion. The only 2 reductions founded at a substantially earlier date, Loreto and San Ignacio, both set up in 1610, were the 2 that survived the onslaught. These 2 reductions were fully integrated into the Spanish economy of Guaira, which may explain the ability to hold off the invaders. But even they suffered significant misfortunes, including a major epidemic in 1618. The other missions fell to the Paulistas rather rapidly, although the exact chronology of these events is unclear. According to a 1629 document, Raposo Tavares himself commanded the destruction of Jesus Maria, San Miguel, and at least 1 other reduction at the head of 86 other Paulistas. It seems likely that the other missions were dismembered by other columns of the 1628 expedition, specifically those of André Fernandez and Manuel Pinto. Once the Guarani population of Guaira was destroyed, or enslaved, the Paulistas turned their attention back to the Guarani further south. They began to attack the missions of Tape and Uruguay, located in what is today the southernmost Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul. The situation in Tape province or Tape resembled that of Guaira, in that the missions had only recently been founded, 1633 to 1634. At the time of the Paulista attack, 1635 to 1641, of the 6 reductions founded by the Jesuits, 3 were destroyed by 1638, with Raposo Tavares and Fernão Diaz Paez leading the most intense raids in 1636 and 1637 respectively, while other groups found their leaders among the backwoodsmen who had acquired valuable experience in the Guaira campaigns. Nonetheless, this time the Paulistas faced major resistance on the part of the Indians. Raposo Tavares' expedition, reputed to have had an estimated 140 Paulistas and 1,500 armed Tupis. You see how many Indians are helping them? That's what's really helping them enslave the Indians in its ranks, right? 1,500 Tupi struggled to overrun the Jesus Maria reduction, where 300 warriors put up stiff resistance. All right, like the Spartans, right? 300 against 1,500. 300 warriors. Shortly thereafter, fearing a general uprising as the inhabitants of San Cristobal, Santa Ana, and San Joaquin grouped together in the Natividad Mission, the raiders decided they had no choice but to retreat. A series of factors converged around 1640 to complicate the Paulistas' quest for Guarani captives. First, the Jesuits, who obviously counted on the support of powerful forces in the colonies and in Europe, began to fight back through legal channels, taking the problem of the missions to the Governor General of Brazil, to Philip IV, and finally to the Pope, thereby securing the first successes in their counter-offensive against the Paulistas. After a fierce campaign in defense of the missions, the Spanish Jesuits convinced the Pope to hand down a strongly worded brief condemning the activities of the Paulistas and Paraguayan slavers. While publication of the brief provoked unrest in Sao Paulo, Santos, and Rio de Janeiro, it was not enough to discourage the Paulistas from continuing their assaults on Jesuit-run villages, for they returned to attack again in 1648 and 1676. In this context, the relocation and defensive organization of the missions was aimed at diminishing the threat posed by the Portuguese. As the Jesuits began to concentrate the reductions in less accessible locations, particularly along the Uruguay and Paraguay rivers, slaving expeditions had to face greater distances, harsher terrain, and the challenges of other indigenous groups such as the Payagua and the Guaycuru in their pursuit of Guarani labor. In addition, through the Spanish crown prohibited the use of firearms by Indians. Evidently, as a precaution against native rebellion, the Jesuits began to arm and organize their wards to defend the missions against the attacks of Paulistas and enemy Indians. In some cases, the priests equipped the Indians with firearms, though it seems that most resistance depended upon traditional weaponry. The militarization of the Jesuit missions, more than any other factor, determined the end of large-scale raids on the Guarani. Unaccustomed to defeat, the Paulistas suffered major setbacks in Uruguay province. In 1638, Guarani warriors killed 9 backwoodsmen from Sao Paulo and took another 17 prisoner at Paguaçu or Cacapaguacu, repelling the expedition led by Pedro Leite Pais, Fernando Diaz's brother. A more crushing defeat came in 1641 when the large bandera of Jerónimo Pedroso de Moraes ran up against indigenous resistance at Moborore. According to a Jesuit eyewitness, 300 Paulistas and 600 Tupi in 130 canoes attacked Jesuits and Indians in their camp on the banks of the Emborore River, a tributary of the Uruguay. After a fierce riverine and land battle, the Paulistas were forced to retreat. Beating on the field of battle, the expedition was subsequently annihilated by hunger and disease, an ironic twist that apparently delighted the Jesuit observer. The following year, the Indians of Emborore regaled a Jesuit visitor with recreating their heroic victory over the Lusitanos, emphasizing the symbolic importance of the event. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and end it right there. But I do hope that you enjoyed the reading. I hope that, this history is not forgotten what happened to these people. Again, millions of people. Remember, 500,000 alone from Central America before the 1550s. Same thing is going on here, guys. Talking about millions. All right. And all these people, as you see here, they were being referred to as Negroes of the land or blacks of the land, Negros de Terra. So who's to say, where they're really getting their slave supply from in history when they tell us it was Africans? How do we know it wasn't Indians from South America or Central America or the Caribbean or even North America? Or even their underside was from Europe. All right. So hope you enjoyed this little lesson on this history and the region here, the Indian slavery that was going on that, gets kind of neglected really, and they want us to focus on what they're calling an African diaspora and not the American indigenous diaspora. Okay, so again, this book was The Blacks of the Land, Indian Slavery, Settler Society, and the Portuguese Colonial Enterprise in South America. Originally written by John M. Monteiro in Portuguese, and it was translated by James Woodward and Barbara Weinstein. Thank you for your contributions and for letting us review the book for educational purposes, fair use. Thank you. Hey, you guys, appreciate you guys sticking around all the way to the end of the reading today. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Wow.